firstly, to start with the presentation, I want to ask something more specific. Recently there's been a discussion about the marriage of Aisha, and I wanted to ask the question, given the acceptance of the Hadith being authentic, can a Muslim adequately believe that the age of Aisha was 9 when she married, without contradiction? Or does...
What do you mean without contradiction?
To say that there may be another hadith from a different source that may contradict the age, or does the study of the hadith entirety lead to sort of an agnostic position on her age?
You seem agitated about this.
Yes.
What is your agitation? Why are you so uncomfortable?
I'm not so uncomfortable about it, but some people are.
What makes you uncomfortable?
No, I'm not uncomfortable about it.
What makes...
The age of Aisha and a lot of marriage.
Why? What makes you uncomfortable?
In the context of now, and then if you're marrying a young girl,
if I sort of put my view,
I think the question is more to do with later sources such as Ibn Hisham and Tabari and Tabaqat ibn Sa'd. They have reports which appear to identify a different age.
Tabari says she was 9 when... Tabari has a very interesting quote. No one ever cites it. Tabari says they signed the marriage, they did the marriage contract when she was 6, but she was young. كانت صغيرة على الجماع. She was too young to have sex, and so they waited, and then they consummated the marriage later. So this is I've looked at all the evidence on these other arguments of how she was older. I don't find it convincing at all. I mean, it's really I understand people why they're making that argument, but I think it's their arguments are very weak. You know that she shahadat Badr, and that she witnessed the Battle of Badr, and that Ibn Omar wasn't allowed to go to participate in battle until he was 15, so she must be at least 15. But that's like saying that in order to go to a Manchester United game, that's a soccer team here, correct? Okay. What's a London version? Chelsea. Arsenal or something. In order to go to an Arsenal game, you have to fulfill the physical requirements of the athletes in the game, which is utter nonsense because she didn't participate in the battle, obviously.
My question wasn't an ethical question.
No, yeah.
I was asking more from the science of Hadith.
The science of Hadith is that Aisha says, the Prophet consummated the marriage with me when I was 9 years old. That's what the Hadith says. There's an authentic Hadith in Bukhari. And even if you don't want to say that Bukhari is, his book is the most authentic, it's the most explicit data you have on this issue. And everything else is implicit, derived from very tenuous assumptions about culture or something, or practice at the time.
So would you say that anyone would go against the understanding of her being a 9 years old is implicit information rather than...
I think it is, because you have to look at... This is a very interesting issue. Okay, this is a very interesting issue. Non-Muslims, from the life in the community of the Prophet in Medina, from his opponents in Mecca, to John of Damascus, died 749 in his polemics against Islam, to Matthew of Paris in the 1100s, to Voltaire, to Gibbon, to the Chanson de Roland, to anybody who wants to insult the Prophet. They had tons of information. They were looking for anything they could use to insult the Prophet. And his sex life was target numero uno. It's in the Quran, the issue of Zainab and Zayd. We have document during his own time, people said, you're committing incest because adopted children are like regular children. This is true in Near East, this is true in the Roman Empire, Roman culture. And the Quran says, no, they're not. This was the biggest, if you look at the instances in which the Zayd-Zainab affair is mentioned by critics of the Prophet from his lifetime until 1900, you will run out of, check marks on the paper before you count the number of times this story is used by opponents of Islam. they also insult him for marrying Aisha. Why? Because he was so obsessed, he's so lustful. He's such an id-driven creature. I don't believe this, just in case someone is recording this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just quoting the opinion of others. He's such an id-driven creature that he has this fantasy of Aisha, a dream about her, and he wants to marry her. No one ever mentions her age, ever, that I've found, until 1905. The British historian David Margoliouth has a book on the rise of Islam, the Prophet in Islam. And he mentions this, and he says it's an ill-advised union. For how else should we characterize the marriage between a man of 53 and a girl of 9? This is the first I've ever seen that anyone mentions this. Why is that? Why is that until the early 20th century no one talks about this? When they are making stuff up about the Prophet to insult him. And they don't bring this up. Because they were all marrying underage girls too. I mean, you have to understand that pre-modern, in fact, even today, peasant societies, to use the Marxist term, societies where you have the vast majority of people live in small agricultural communities, and agricultural work is the predominant form of livelihood. Marriage is very early, especially for women, generally right after puberty. And as I tell my students, yeah, Gandhi got married very young. Because you have to remember, and I've said this before in other lectures, and I think it's very important, our notions of what you're supposed to do in life are based on our lifestyle. If you don't have high school and college, or whatever, college and university and medical school, and you have to go get a job, if you're just living in the desert and you're tending goats all day, and you're a boy and you go through puberty, and being a boy, male who's gone through puberty, I can tell you, speak for the rest of the men out there, basically 99.9% of your brain at that point is occupied with sex. And I don't know what the percentage is for women, but I assume that women at some point start getting interested in sex too. And you're sitting out there with goats, and you've got nothing to do. You have no hope in your life of ever doing anything except tending goats. Why in God's name would you not get married? It makes no sense. Of course you should. And they're like, oh, you're not emotionally mature. What? What is that emotional mature? What does that mean, emotionally mature? This guy doesn't know what emotionally mature is. He doesn't, people don't think about that. Well, what about, power dynamic in the relationship? What? Power dynamic in the relationship? This is all this is all completely anachronistic concepts we're imposing on the past or on societies that justifiably maybe don't care about this. So the argument, no one mentioned this because it wasn't a concern. And England, interestingly enough, historically has relatively high marriage ages, even in the Middle Ages, in the mid-20s. England's a very odd place historically in that sense. But this starts becoming an issue in the 20th century, and Muslim writers start dealing with it. And the interesting thing is, who are the people who start dealing with this issue first? That's not the ulama. It's people like Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad, the Egyptian prose writer, poet who died in 1964, he's an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist. He's not an Islamist. He's not, he's first and foremost interested in reviving the identity of Egypt, of his community, of his world, of defending it against the West. He sees that appreciating and understanding early Islam is important for that, so he writes lots of books on the Prophet and on the companions. And he's the first person I've seen who takes up this issue of trying to try and figure out a way to argue that Aisha was older. He said she was 14 or 15. But because he's concerned about the image in Western eyes. Because in that point, if you look at fatwas in Egypt, you start getting fatwa requests saying, why is it, isn't it bad that there's an old man marrying a young woman? Shouldn't we have a law against this? Shouldn't we have a law? In 1923, the Egyptian law changes and makes 16 the minimum age for marriage for women. In Syria, around the same time, you get it at 18, 16 or 18. this becomes a big deal in debates over law in Muslim countries, importing Western legal codes. And a lot of ulama fight against these marriage age restrictions. And they only accept them as procedural restrictions. That they say a Sharia marriage is valid, with the agreement is valid at any age. The consummation should only take place when the woman is physically able to bear it, which is the traditional pre-modern Sharia rule. But the ruler, has the right to restrict procedurally what can be registered as a marriage. And you see scholars like Ali Tantawi in Syria, like Abdul Halim Mahmoud in Egypt, who defend the idea of making marriage age 16 or 18 because they feel this is actually a good way to promote social welfare. But you can't say, from a Sharia perspective, you cannot say that what the Prophet did was wrong, because the Prophet can't commit sins.
That wasn't so much of an ethical question, but what about hadith that are deemed to be sahih, authentic, which do sometimes go against some ethical precepts that we hold? For example, what about the hadith that talks about the woman's deficiency in her thinking? How do we, my difficulty is, when do we start to say, hold on, this may be problematic, even though it's actually authentic?
That's a good question. This is the big question. This is the ultimate question, right? Which is, there's a hadith that seems to contradict what I think is reasonable, possible, or right. How do I deal with that? There's a couple of approaches. The sort of traditional Sunni approach would be that God and the Prophet know better on a moral issue. Another approach is also legitimately Islamic and Sunni and Shia. It would be, there are instances, for example, there's a hadith that says, Shahra Eid la yanqusan, in Sunan of Abu Dawud, that 2 months of festival are never short. But Eid and Dhul Hijjah, Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah. But we know that Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah is frequently not 30 days, sometimes they're 29 days. This hadith is on its face false. So what do people like Ibn Hanbal al-Bukhari say? They say, well, it's not literal then. It means either the barakah you get in these months will always be complete, or Ibn Hanbal said they're never both short in the same year, which is wrong. So if you see something that contradicts empirical reality, you just realize that it's figurative. And I mentioned this before in other lectures I've given, but the hadith of when the Prophet asked Abu Dhar, do you know where the sun goes after it sets? He says, God and the Prophet are more knowledgeable. And he says, it goes before the throne of God, and it prostrates. Seeks permission to rise again. People in the early 20th century, Muslims who are pious Muslims, they want to believe in their religion. They flip out over this hadith. It makes them, it panics them. There are writers who reject the whole hadith tradition because of hadiths like this. It contradicts clear scientific reality that these early Muslims didn't know. How much more subject to historical contingency can a hadith be? Are we really going to base our religion on ideas that are clearly wrong, that someone believed based on scientific ideas that later turned out to be false? Medieval Muslims, but my response is, medieval Muslims also got confused by this hadith, because it doesn't make any sense. If you look in Nawawi talks about it, how does the sun prostrate? It doesn't have it's like a wall. What is it? I don't understand how this works. So they say it's figurative. It means it prostrates to God's, that shajaru wa najmu yasjudan. The sun and trees prostrate to God. So people have to. You asked the biggest question in the history of Islamic interpretation, and then you want me to not answer it. So what is it you're trying to say?
So I've got sort of the gist of your answer. So given what you said to the second question, is it not reasonable then to question the first question on that basis, ethical precepts?
But I didn't answer the full question.
No, I'm just saying that you see it as an option. I'm just saying, not that I believe that it is a question ethically, but I'm saying there are individuals that do see that as an ethical question, and there is a contentious issue there. But given the answer to your second question, that it's actually an option to revisit hadith in this life, because it clearly goes against empirical evidence, then why not apply the same type of reasoning for the first scenario about Aisha's age?
But I haven't. You need to spend more time on Muslim scholars, because they're never going to give you a short answer to a question. And I'm giving you the menu options. You can't ask me to answer the question before I finish answering the question. I'm giving you different options, right? There's possibility. One possibility is you simply say, "Sami'na wa ata'na." God said, "We hear, we obey." The sun prostrates. Okay, the sun prostrates. Fine, it prostrates. I admit it. Or you can say, okay, I understand, but it doesn't make sense to me. How does this work? Literally, it doesn't work. It contradicts. That's why the 2 months in everyone's short hadith is a great example, because this is something you can't deny. No one is going to debate whether or not the month of Ramadan is 29 or 30 days that year. You can get an astronomical calendar and figure this out. It's not subject to interpretation. The hadith is false on its face. Therefore, it's either not true, the Prophet didn't know what he was talking about, or we interpret it figuratively. The first two options, a Muslim would like to rule out, because they'd like to think that the Prophet speaks the truth. They'd like to think that their science of hadith authentication works. So the third option is taken. You interpret it figuratively, which is totally reasonable, because figurative use of language, according to some scholars like Giambattista Vico in the 1700s, figurative language is the real nature of language. Really, figurative metaphor is how we speak. Literal language is not. Literal understanding is a secondary feature. So there's the problem, however, when you get to ethical issues, because there's no objective standard to measure ethics. There's no objective standard to measure right and wrong. Because right and wrong are different for different people. There's no, what?
I find that...
You don't agree?
No. I think
really? You're not an Ashari. You're not, I mean, what is... So, who came up with this crazy idea that there's no such thing as universal right and wrong? Which crazy lunatic came up with this idea? This is Protagoras. This is one of Plato's opponents in Plato's mind, Protagoras. This is what the sophists are accused of not believing in universal rights and wrong. They said right and wrong are relative to what city you're in. Right and wrong are based on convention. They're based on culture, which is exactly what Sunni Muslims say. I don't know about 12 or Shia. I'm not saying, I just don't know the answer to that. Is that right and wrong are conventional. They're based on place and time. And if you want to make universal arguments for that, you better come up with some way to justify that. The Muslim answer is that the universal answers can be provided by Scripture, by revelation from God. Other arguments for universal rights and wrong now are based on things like human rights, universal human rights. The problem with that argument is that they keep adding more human rights, and you sit and wonder that 1 year something's right, and the next 10 years later it's wrong, or vice versa. And so one wonders how truly universal this can be, or to what extent I should be sacrificing my religious values for a system of values that seems to change every decade. Right? And this is...
Yeah. I think, after you finish on the answer to that question, I think we're wrapping up and we'll come back at 2 o'clock.
Sorry, I don't mean to go beyond. He asked this gigantic question. So the issue then, I'll be done. I'll finish presently.
Could we do one more question?
So the issue, the question is, how do you determine what's right and wrong?
Yeah,
and one has to.
I wasn't arguing for a position. I was just saying, is it reasonable and should be accepted as an opinion, a valid opinion, given the answer to your second question with all the options? Could someone revisit the age of Aisha and say, for ethical reasons, maybe it's not true? That's what I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that, but then my question would be, what motivates you? And this is what people like Ahmed Shakir, who wrote against Abbas al-Qadi, wrote. They said, why are you doing this? What you're admitting, what you're saying, is that the critics are correct. Where do you get your values, is he saying? Where do you get your values? Do you get them from your religion? Or do you get them from some other culture? That, by the way, 10 years ago didn't care about this.
I do find that a bit simplistic.
No, I don't think it's simplistic at all.
Because there are hadith that talk about, for example, the offspring of the adulteress is worse than the adulterer.
And guess what? They don't interpret these. Vast majority of Muslim scholars either say that hadith is false, or they interpret it figuratively.
But why? Because ethically it doesn't make sense.
Because the person's la taziru waziratun wizra ukhra. How can somebody be blamed for something that that they didn't do?
But that's an ethical precept.
That is a Quranic ethical precept.
Yes, of course.
A Quranic ethical precept, not one based on external sources.
But hold on, but there's a hadith that actually states that, so we have to balance that out with the precepts that we have. And the Quran speaks about Islamic precepts. I mean, it's an absurd argument, because what you're saying is that effectively we cannot determine and identify justice without revelation. And I just think that when we look at the scholarly discourse, there are some issues that aren't stipulated by the Quran and the hadith. And they had to use their reason to develop an opinion. So I think
if you want to talk about justice or equity in a specific situation, every day we use our reason to come up with what is just or equitable in a specific situation. And we don't necessarily refer to scripture. However, no one is going to argue that my decision in this specific situation should be universally applied to all human beings in all places and all times, retroactively applied to people in the past and used to judge them. That's nonsense. So there's a difference between using reason to come up with justice or equity in a specific situation and saying that it can derive universal principles that should be applied to all. That's what I'm arguing.
I wasn't arguing for absolute right.
Yeah.
Just one.
Sorry, one more question.
That you may not be able to reconcile with your current perspective of things. He said either you take it allegorically or you take it metaphorically, figuratively you interpret that, or you say that Prophet spoke what he spoke was nonsense. But nobody says that you can't open the hadith to scrutiny.
Yes.
You earlier mentioned the Dahla, we said everything in there was better than that.
Yeah, I mean that was the third option that I didn't get to mention, which is that you look at the hadith and maybe you decide it's not authentic. But my question is, what is the criterion for deciding it's not authentic?
Could we not employ tools that have developed since, for example, the campaign? Since then, we have corpus of the hadith and tools that have developed to continue to use these newly developing tools to scrutinize existing hadith that may be taken for granted as being sahih.
Yeah, I mean, some people will probably dislike my answer, but yes, I would take the position that Sheikh Albani said, which is, by the way, Muslim scholars had said for centuries before that, which is that everything is subject to debate. Everything is subject to evaluation. The reason why people rejected his argument and said, you're criticizing Sahihain, which no one had really objected to before the 1700s, or really the 20th century, is because is what it meant, what's behind what you're doing. It's not about, if you want to sit and criticize, scholars get together and criticize hadiths and Bukhari and Muslim, no one's going to have a problem. What's the problem? The problem is the criticism against Bukhari and Muslim are really criticism against the Islamic ethical system. The idea of scripture, the idea of religion as being the main reference in your life, the idea that you should overturn things in the past because of fads in the present. That's why there's such defensiveness about those books, and defensiveness about reevaluating hadith. it's not because scholars really reject reevaluating hadiths. They never did. But they're afraid that they're opening a door to modern ephemeral fads or ephemeral beliefs overturning centuries of consensus.
Where do you draw the line?
Why should we be afraid of opening doors? This whole idea of Sadda
The reason why you're afraid of opening the doors is because opening the doors causes conflict. And when you open the doors without any kind of control, you get, but people are always saying, you know, there's like the Muslim Martin Luther of the week, like there's the Quran Discovery article, every 6 months there's a new Muslim Martin Luther. Does anyone, I mean, I'm not from, you know, I live in the United States, I don't live in Europe. People remember like what the Protestant Revolution, or the Protestant Reformation caused. Utter complete chaos, politically and theologically and socially, until people realized that no, you can't just have everybody revalue. You have to have some kind of interpretive control, otherwise the world becomes unmanageable.
But the people around Dahlu, for example, they would have taken what he said as person and so. If Dahlu said about the Muslim Ahmad was, you know, that was acceptable one way or another in Sahih, then the people around him would have taken that on board as accepted. Now we're looking at it and say, well, no, we can't. You know, we need to relook at this and reevaluate it. So it should continue.
I agree with you, but that we have to recognize that within a religious tradition, there have to be certain controls on interpretation. What you're talking about is a tangential issue. When you're talking about the details, yeah, people can reevaluate to their heart's content. You know, when you're talking about the core, like the Quran, like things that are agreed upon, like there's 5 prayers, or that fornication is prohibited. If you want to open up that to discussion, the religious tradition will cease to exist. It will evaporate. Well, I think it will. I mean, look at you know, look at religion in many European countries, or in urban America. It doesn't mean anything anymore. You know, my haircutter, he comes and says like, everything's about God, man. It's all about God, God, God. I was like, I didn't want to say it to him, but I was like, what does that mean? I mean, it just means nothing. I don't know what it means. Anyway.
Okay, guys, we'll have to stop here because obviously